So today I'm going to be giving my top 10 favorite horror movies of 2024. I have the list right here. Now let me just say, this was a pretty daunting task. That is because 2024 has been a phenomenal year for horror cinema. We've gotten a lot of big studio surprises, a lot of hidden gems, which a few of those are going to be on this list. Now this being a horror list, I obviously wanted this video to be uploaded in October, and it's damn near December. The reason why this took me so long is because not only with my personal and work life, but I also wanted to watch as many horror movies as I could before I actually made my definitive top 10 list. And although I didn't get to watch every single movie on my watch list, I think I watched a good amount. Timestamps are going to be in the description as always. I'll be giving a small spoiler-free review for each and every single film, just so you can get an idea, see if it's something you may want to add to your watch list. Now lastly, one more thing before we get started. If you search up some of these movies, some of them may say that they came out in 2023. That could be for a couple reasons. One, it could have been only available at a film festival like Cannes or Sundance last year and barely became available to the public this year. Or it could just be a foreign film that finally got its international release this year. Since I am a United States citizen, I am considering any movie that became available for me to watch this year a 2024 release. Alright, with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. At number 10, we have Frogman, directed by Anthony Cousins, starring Justin Jones, Chelsea Grant, and Benny Barrett. So this is a found footage horror movie, and I hate to make the early comparison already, but it is similar to the Blair Witch Project, at least in terms of narrative structure. Not spoiling either one, in both films, the first act, they take things relatively slow. Instead of focusing on more traditional scares, they are used in the first act to build the mystique and the lore of the monster that they're searching for. In the Blair Witch Project, that being obviously the Blair Witch, and in Frogman, that being a mythical creature named Frogman. But Frogman does take things a little too slow at times. At least in the Blair Witch Project, it does a good job at establishing a slow burn psychological dread. That's what's sort of feeding us in terms of the hook, in terms of keeping us invested in the story. Frogman, the first act, is pretty boring, a little bland. It is funny. Main character is funny in a sort of laugh at him, he's a loser type. In terms of the story, nothing really grabs our attention until we get to the first half. Because up until that point, we were following our main characters, our trio, and they were spending the majority of the time talking to the townspeople that supposedly live near this Frogman thing. And in these interviews, you see some of the people who are clearly just lying. Some of them just want to be a part of the story. Some of them are spreading hearsay. Some are just fanatical, batshit insane people. The movie kind of gives off this idea of, okay, this Frogman thing is probably just some myth tourist attraction to just bring people to this town. Then we start meeting people who are clearly hiding some sort of information. The protagonists are asking them basic questions and they get aggravated and they overall just seem a little shady. Once we meet those people, the story ramps up to an absurd degree. And it is amazing. This is one of the most unique and creative found footage horror movies I've ever seen, and I expect nothing less from a movie called Frogman. There are moments that will freak you out, there are jaw-dropping moments, there are moments that are so absurd it borderline turns into a black comedy. I wouldn't consider this movie horrifying, like it didn't scare me. I found it to be more insane and I had such a fun time with it. I'm a bit iffy on the ending, which you are going to hear a few times in this list, because even though these are my 10 favorite horror movies, no movie is perfect, and lo and behold, horror movies sometimes kind of flop on their ending. This movie kind of being a good example. I didn't taint the experience, this is still obviously one of my favorites, but it just felt like it had sort of a blue ball type of ending. Overall, I would recommend this movie, especially to anyone who wants to see something unique and different in their horror. This is a insane, literally insane movie. Very creative. When things kick off, it's a ride. Alright, now at number 9, we have Mads, directed by David Moreau, starring Milton Ritchie, Laurie Pavey, and Lucille Guillaume. This is a French movie, and there's gonna be a couple French movies on this list, so full warning for some of the pronunciations you're about to hear. Yes, this is a French horror film, and it is shot entirely in one take, meaning there are no cuts. We're following specifically the perspective of one camera the entire time. When I first heard about that, I assumed that this movie was going a 1917 sort of route, where it's meant to look like one seamlessly unbroken shot, but behind the scenes there are obviously some editing tricks that blended in multiple takes together. But the director of Mads has said that this movie was legitimately from beginning to end shot in one sequence, which I'm not gonna lie, I do find that a little hard to believe, but then again, I have no reason not to believe him. So if he actually did pull that off, him and his team, that is an extremely impressive feat to do. So props to them, because that is crazy, especially for what's shown in this movie. So this film takes place over the course of one night, and we're following a young man, like a 18-year-old high school kid. It's his birthday, so he decides, being a boy genius that he is, to take some drugs and drive to his birthday party. On the way to the party, he sees a strange girl on the road, and I'm gonna be as vague as possible. He picks her up, something happens, and it spirals into the worst night of his life. A legitimate nightmare. I'm also going to call this movie crazy, but in a different way. Where Frogman was crazy, it was crazy because of the absurd creative imagination of it all. Mads is crazy because it is flat out batshit madness. Things escalate, but not necessarily in an absurd way. A little bit, but it's more into a rising chaos. This movie is such a trip, and the one take really helps add to the immersion of it all. There are legitimate tense, scary moments throughout. The sound design really helps capture this foreboding atmosphere that things are just not what they seem. And as this movie continues and the chaos just ramps up, nothing is never really explained to you. Like, it doesn't hold your hand to tell you this is what's happening. Not necessarily complicated, but the movie does use more visual storytelling to give you kind of a concept of what's happening. Like, if you pay attention to certain characters and their behaviors, especially in the first act, you can put two and two together by the final act and kind of get a picture. Oh, so that's what's going on. Again, it's nothing necessarily complicated, but not holding your hand and explaining specifically what's happening, it really helps add to the confusion and therefore the chaos of it all. The pacing was really strong. It's a very gripping story up until we get to sort of the middle act. As the movie goes on, it kind of does lose its charm a little bit. I definitely felt more invested and intrigued in the first act. But it never gets terrible. It is entertaining from start to finish, even though when we get closer to the finish line, it does kind of dimmer a little bit. It is still a wild, fun ride. Maybe some of the VFX could have been a bit better. The acting was really strong, but since I'm assuming this is probably because of the one take, some of the scenes, some of the acting bits were a little, I was thinking, I don't know if I buy that. But those were little moments. Again, I would say that this is a solid, strong, very creative, awesome horror movie. Obviously, I would recommend this to anybody if they don't have epilepsy. All right, at number 8, we have Milk and Cereal, directed by Curry Barker, starring Curry Barker and Cooper Tomlinson. This is another found footage horror movie. It runs an hour long and it's on YouTube right now completely for free, and that is because the makers of this film are YouTubers. Curry and Cooper run a channel, I believe, called That's a Bad Idea, and that's where you'll find this film. And I say this because this is probably the biggest hidden gem I've seen all year. I was very much surprised by this. I think they're more known for their comedy skits. I'm not too familiar with their work, but if this is what they could do with horror and with the $800 budget, I'm on board for anything that they do in the future. In this found footage horror, we are following two YouTuber pranksters who are constantly pranking each other, trying to see who can pull off the bigger and better prank. And things get dark, and I'll leave it at that. Not a whole lot shown in terms of graphic violence, but there is a handful of scenes that are legitimately disturbing and unnerving. Again, without showing really any amateur, edgy graphic violence. It's uncomfortable, and that is because, for the most part, the acting from these guys, especially from the writer and the director, Curry Barker, phenomenal. Both leads are very strong in this, but Curry Barker, he plays a character that you can easily turn into a cringe, unironic comedy, but he pulls it off. He balances the tone out really good, and I think also the score helps. The score is very effective at setting this mood, this eerie mood. Hidden gem of the year. This is definitely one of the creepier found footage movies I've seen in a long time. If there is any critique I had, I would say the narrative structure is sort of a double-edged sword for me. Because it seems like there are two different plots happening, and although it did keep the story interesting, after a while it did feel a bit jarring. As if the movie wasn't really sure what it wanted to be. And this accumulates into the ending, which did feel a bit rushed. But overall, I did still enjoy the movie. Simple, unique premise, like a mix of Be My Cat and fucking Game Night, and a little hint of Black Mirror's Crocodile episode. Like I said, this movie's on YouTube right now, completely for free, and like any other horror film, I would recommend you watch this by yourself late at night with the lights off, no notifications, and enjoy the creepy experience. This was a very much fantastic surprise. And personally, I am excited to see what Curry Barker could do with an actual feature-length budget, because if he could do this with $800, I feel like it's only a matter of time before we start seeing his films in an actual theater. Alright, at number 7, we have Infested, directed by Sebastian Vanishik, starring Theo Christine and Lisa Nyarko. I warned you about the pronunciations. This is another French horror film, and this one in particular freaked me out. So we're following a group of people who live in an apartment complex. Amongst this group of people is our protagonist, who brings home a spider he recently just bought. What seems at first like a normal spider, it escapes the box he puts it in, and it starts causing havoc. It starts laying eggs, which hatches hundreds of other spiders. These spiders seem to grow into adult size in what seemingly a matter of minutes. And then those spiders start hatching more eggs to the point where it feels like this thing is cloning itself. I don't believe I'm an arachnophobe. I don't have this unnatural fear or reaction to a spider when I see it in the zoo or in my house or at my job. That being said, this movie still got under my skin bad. This scared the shit out of me. It's such a simple yet effective concept. The way that this movie displays its spiders, it's so discomforting. They're fast, they're feral, they're like this big, so they're big enough to freak you out, but also small enough to hide basically anywhere. Not only that, but they seem to be smart enough to know where to hide and when to jump. You got normal shots of normal, ordinary objects you would see in a home, like a towel. You see our characters reaching for this towel, and it's so tense because you just know there's a big ass spider just hiding in that towel. And it's like the perfect setup for a jump scare, and the director knew this and capitalized on it because those scenes, best scenes in the movie. As the movie goes on, you start seeing web across the stairs, across the hallways. You start seeing more bigger spiders on the walls and in the air vents. Ugh, the hallway scene. It's so icky. When I say it's effective, I watched this movie in my room on my bed, and every now and then, I kid you not, I had to turn around and just feel my bed, flip my pillows, and it just sent a chill down my spine. First act of this movie take things relatively slow. It focuses more on our characters, character interactions, why we should be invested in them. And when the second act comes in, we start seeing the spiders. It's just so awesome because it's so effective because they're just spiders. It's nothing paranormal where we could almost have a barrier of, okay, this is just a movie, it's not real. And yes, there are things that happen in this movie that are obviously not realistic. At the end of the day, these are spiders. Where even if you're not an arachnophobe, to a certain degree, I feel like everybody has some level of fear of spiders. Spiders in this movie reminded me of the design of the facehuggers in Alien Romulus, where you got these little freaks with these massive long limbs, and they're so fast and they jump, and ugh. And there's also thousands of them. It's like the perfect formula for a horror movie. Unfortunately, my only critique would be, lo and behold, the ending. The last 20 minutes of this movie sort of shifted from an unsettling, scary survival to a more action monster horror movie. And although it doesn't get terrible, it definitely is the least creative, least tense part of the film. It does drag, but if it kept the tension and the horror that it built in the first two acts, kid you not, this movie would do to spiders what Jaws did to sharks. Nonetheless, this is obviously one of my favorites of the year, definitely my favorite creature feature, and I would recommend it. Some creative, legitimately scary scenes to the point where if you're like me, where you're not even an arachnophobe, there are still gonna be moments that will make your skin crawl. At number 6, we have Longlegs, directed by Oz Perkins, starring Micah Monroe and Nicolas Cage. This is the perfect example of marketing being a blessing and a curse. On one hand, you did your job right. You got people unbelievably hyped for your movie with the trailers, with the posters. The marketing was perfect. Everybody, including me, was very much excited for this film. This is obviously the goal of marketing. That being said, if you market your movie as the scariest film of the decade or this evil, horrifying masterpiece that we haven't seen since The Exorcist, that excitement is gonna quickly turn into expectation, and those expectations will literally never be met, let alone surpassed. I've seen this movie twice, and I did enjoy it both times. I thought this was a very well-made, slow-burn psychological thriller. Now, this movie to me wasn't horrifying, it was more unsettling. With its creepy imagery and editing, and the heavy satanic visuals, and the bleak and brutal depictions of some of the violence, the movie really does capture this sense of hopelessness, this cold evilness that's just surrounding our characters in the film as a whole. I could understand why some people were disappointed by this film. To a degree, I was too, but that's only because I really wanted this movie to scare me. Before you comment, oh no shit, it's a horror movie, you want to scare you? A lot of horror movies don't do that. I was hoping that this would be one of the few. It didn't, but I still enjoyed it. Again, that is the gift and curse with marketing. Don't let your expectations dictate the actual quality of a film, because this movie legitimately is a well-made movie. You can call it overrated or dog shit or not scary. That's your opinion by all means. But this is not a bad movie. It may not be for you, but it is an objectively well-made film. Cinematography is not talked about enough. This is one of the most beautiful movies I've seen all year. The lighting, the shot composition, the colors that we get. It's a very visually pleasing movie, and story-wise, we start off the movie with a very uncanny, creepy character interaction. And after the credits, once we get some important character introductions, we really dive headfirst into the mystery. And as it unfolds, not only does it get more interesting, but we, along with the protagonist, start understanding, okay, this serial killer case goes deeper than what we thought. Acting wise, Micah Monroe was great as Agent Lee Harker. She does a phenomenal job in so many subtle details, like her body language, the way that she walks, and it's a nice yin-yang to Nicolas Cage's performance as Longlegs, because he is not subtle. I could see why people say it's hit or miss, because it is Nicolas Cage. I'm a fan of Nicolas Cage, but I do understand it can be quite difficult to look past the fact that he is Nicolas Cage. In Longlegs, you either buy the uncanny bizarreness of it all, or you don't buy it and you just see Nicolas Cage being Nicolas Cage. And for me, there were moments where it did tread on that, but it never went too left field. I did enjoy him as Longlegs. I thought he pulled off a fantastic sort of breath of fresh air take on the serial killer antagonist. Because we've gotten the Kevin Spacey from Seven, Anthony Hopkins, Silence of the Lambs serial killer before, where he's this quiet, genius level psychopath. Longlegs, this performance, let's just say he doesn't go that route. It's unique in a good way, like I said. I think he plays off this almost inhuman, creepy, unpredictable psychopath very well. Overall, a strong movie. Don't expect The Conjuring or Hereditary. Expect a psychological thriller mystery with horror elements like Zodiac or Memories of Murder, Silence of the Lambs, Seven, or the movie that inspired Longlegs the most. Alright, now heading into the top 5. At number 5, we have The First Omen, directed by Arkasha Stevenson, starring Nell Tiger-Free and Ralph Ineson. The First Omen, aka The Better Immaculate. This was the biggest surprise of the year. Not the hidden gem like Milk and Cereal. I mean surprise as in, I had no expectations for this movie at all. I thought this was gonna be dog shit. See, that's because legacy sequels don't really do anything for me. I won't go out of my way to avoid them, but I'm not necessarily hyped for them. They always feel like a bunch of movie executives get together and think, what's a popular movie from back in the day that has a very recognizable IP name in pop culture, and how can we make a soulless money cash grab sequel for it? And although there are a few exceptions of that, I do think that the point still stands. Now, I have seen the original Omen, and I liked it. I thought it was okay. I don't love the original as much as a lot of people do, but I do understand its influence. I do think it's iconic, and there were some genuine good ideas I liked about the movie. Other than the original Omen, I haven't seen the sequels, so I really had no idea what to expect with this film. This being a prequel, I was thinking, okay, from where the original started off, there can be an interesting story with that, and they delivered. Story-wise, not only was this movie strong, but this was one of the darkest movies I've seen all year. In terms of visuals, this movie shows plenty of very fucked up, dark imagery and scenarios that I've really have ever seen in a big studio horror movie. The First Omen pulls no punches, and I was shocked by that because, again, this is sort of a mainstream horror movie, and I feel like a lot of scenes would be too strange and dark and weird and unsettling for most mainstream audiences, which would probably explain the box office. The horror in this movie is legitimately good. This is the first film in my top 10 that I would consider effectively scary. The nun scene, the girl in the corner scene, the hand scene, oh. There's a few well-executed jump scares, and in between these jump scares, you have this building of this dreadful atmosphere that really keeps you on your toes throughout the movie. And when I say it shows a lot of fucked up imagery, it has a purpose. It doesn't feel amateur or edgy or torture porn about it. It makes everything feel so vile and icky, like you're witnessing something truly evil. I think that adds to the horror because obviously not only are the scenes and the atmosphere very much well executed, but the themes of this movie are very, let's say, some are subtle and some are not subtle. This movie touches on grooming, body autonomy, the systemic control and societal role of women, and it's very good at making you just feel icky and wrong for watching it. The acting is great, especially from the main lead, Nell Tiger-Free. She had to do so much with this movie and she pulls it off tremendously. Cinematography is also great. At points it feels like it was legitimately shot as if it was shot in the 70s. The only complaint I would have with this movie is the ending. See, the pro of doing a prequel is that you already know where your movie has to end up at, so it could kind of help you sort of lead the way. But on the other side of that coin is it could also restrict your own vision, because I do feel like this film was not a soulless money grab. This movie had its own purpose, it had its own story to tell, but the ending of this film felt like their hands were tied, as if they had to connect this film with the original. It just didn't feel like a satisfying conclusion. But like my other favorites on this list, the ending was not bad to the point where it literally ruined the experience. This movie, I highly recommend it to really any horror fan. And the good news with this being a prequel, you don't have to know anything about the Omen or anything in the Omen franchise. In some ways, it may add to your enjoyment. Like the last 5 minutes, even though it is a bit eye-rolly, if you've seen the original Omen, you'd be like, oh my god. But it's not needed. This could be literally your first introduction to the Omen franchise, and it would be a fantastic way to start. Alright, at number 4, we have The Substance, directed by Corley Farja, starring Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this movie at all because I do have a spoiler-free review on it on my channel if you want to take a look at it and see specifically why this movie is so high on my list. But in short, this is one of the greatest body horror films we've gotten of the 21st century. This movie is a fantastic, insane thrill ride. Even though the message and the theme of societal standards and self-hatred is so loud and in your face, and therefore very bleak once you just think about it and realize a lot of people are suffering from these societal standards as we speak, the movie is still somehow able to balance a lot of absurdness and comedy to the point where it becomes a black comedy. It's paced very well. You will not be bored with this movie. It literally feels like a roller coaster, and again, I cannot reiterate, the body horror, absolutely phenomenal. Again, if you want to know more, I do have a spoiler-free review on my channel. Take a look at it. But yes, I would highly recommend The Substance. One of my favorite, not even just horror movies, just one of my favorite movies of the year. I know I've said the word crazy a lot in this list. If I had to choose one film that would be the craziest, it would be The Substance. Alright, at number 3 is Exhuma, directed by Jang Jae-hyun, starring Kim Gyeon and Choi Min-sik. Pronunciations, you already know. This is a Korean film. Now, I am a big fan of Korean cinema. Off the top of my head, I could think of some heavy hitters like Park Chan-wook, Lee Shang-dong, Bong Joon-ho, and the horror movies that come out of this country, my god. Side note, The Wailing, top 5 greatest horror films of all time. Watch it. Now, even without knowing the plot synopsis of this film or not seeing any of the trailers, knowing nothing about this movie, admittedly, my expectations were still pretty high just knowing that it was a Korean film, and it did not disappoint. If we're talking just purely atmosphere, if you're one of these horror heads that like going to psychological horror movies, that love the dread and the tone that those movies build, this is movie of the year. It's so patient at building this incredibly eerie sense of dread and doom, like something truly vile and evil is just surrounding our characters. It's like a perfect mix of psychological and folklore horror. So we're following a group of people who are hired to dig up a grave. Now at first they don't want to because they just sense there's something sinister about the grave that they're not being told. However, they still dig it up, and repercussions happen, to say the least. This movie does not rely on jump scares at all. It relies more on supernatural and unsettling sequences that are happening throughout the film that create this, like I said, eerie sense of tension to the point where even though nothing's popping out at you, throughout the movie, you just feel scared. And that's because of the incredible filmmaking, the pacing, what they choose to show and when to show it, the acting, the score, the cinematography, everything just perfectly captures that atmosphere. Now, the type of horror that this movie has is not for everybody. If you're a fan of The Shining or Hereditary, 9 times out of 10, you're gonna love this movie. But if you find those boring, I wouldn't be surprised if you found this one boring too. It's got great writing. I really love it when a horror movie actually takes time to develop its story and its characters rather than just think, okay, how can we make our audience jump in this scene and the next scene and the next scene without paying literally any regard to anything else. There are some unforgettable scary moments in this movie. Again, without spoiling it, the snake scene, the samurai scene. If you're in the mood for a slow burn psychological horror movie, this is the horror film of 2024 for you to watch. Alright, at number 2, we have Red Rooms, directed by Pascal Plante, starring Juliette Garipi and Laurie Babin. Now, as you can tell by my godlike pronunciations, this is another French horror film. Well, technically it's Canadian. I do believe it was filmed and it takes place in Montreal, but 95% of the dialogue is in French. Not in terms of horror, but in general, this is my favorite movie of the year so far. The only reason it's number 2 and not number 1 on this list is because it doesn't feel like a traditional scary movie. Even though it's classified as horror and easily has the most disturbing content out of any movie on this list, it's horror in the vein of Seven and Memories of Murder. So it leans more in a sort of unsettling, dark crime thriller with horror elements, rather than a traditional straight up horror movie. So in Red Rooms, we are following a woman who is deeply obsessed with an ongoing serial killer case. She attends the trial of a man currently being accused of murdering 3 young teenage girls in the most horrific, barbaric, evil ways you can think of via a red room. For those of you who'd never heard of a red room, it is a unconfirmed myth in the real world where in the deepest, darkest corners of the dark web, past all the illegal drug and weapons trading, past the horrendous, we'll say unethical video content, you can find a red room, which is essentially a live stream of a torture. As people are watching and tuning in, they can pay and drop donations to suggest what the next method of torture should be for the victim. As of right now, I don't believe that there's ever been any confirmed cases of a red room. It's more just the human imagination, speculation, and hearsay. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. You'll never catch me saying, oh yeah, red rooms are real, the elites do it all the time, they use Bitcoin. Without no evidence whatsoever suggesting that. However, just knowing how depraved the dark web is with the content that has been confirmed, as technology advances, I wouldn't be surprised if these things do become legitimate. That being said, this film is a fictional court case on a red room, and as you can imagine with the subject matter, it is very dark, very disturbing. Because not only is our protagonist captivated by the case itself, but she's also obsessed with the defendant. There are 3 victims total, and the feds have confirmed 2 videos of 2 of the murders, but they have yet to find the 3rd, which would be the live stream of the murder of the youngest victim, which I believe is an 8-year-old little girl. And our protagonist, being obsessed with this case, sets out to find that video. Now, this movie shows no violence, it's not graphic at all, yet it still has some of the most powerful, stomach-turning scenes you'll get out of any movie this year. That is because not only the obvious subject matter, but the masterful directing. It feels so real and cold and brutal. Like, the opening scene is literally 20 minutes of the defense and the prosecution giving their opening statements on the case, and it sets out the tone perfectly. It grabs you and it makes you feel like you're actually there watching this case, and as the details come out, it just feels so vile and wrong. This type of story could have easily been told in a shock value, edgy, misery porn bullshit sort of way, but it's not. It's phenomenal because it's so mature and confident in telling its story, and it has a point to say. It shows how apathetic and desensitized we can become, especially in this technological age that we live in. Consequences of how easy and accessible it is to see terrible shit on a daily basis because of the internet, where something that should disgust you raises your curiosity to the point where it almost becomes entertainment. I know this may sound like I'm describing like a cheesy, bad Black Mirror episode, but I guarantee you with the writing and the directing, it's not. Easily the best cinematography I've seen all year. One of the best looking movies of the decade. The only film I've seen this year that even stands with it, maybe Dune 2. The score, the writing, the acting, everything just so unbelievably top tier. Again, favorite movie of the year. It's a fantastic character study. It feels like a mix of David Fincher and Michael Haneke. So if you're a fan of those directors, highly recommend you watch this movie. Okay, so for my number 1 favorite horror movie of the year, I got Smile 2. I'm just kidding, it's Oddity. Oddity, directed by Damien McCarthy, starring Carolyn Bracken and Gwillem Lee. So in my number 2 spot, I did say that Red Rooms is my favorite movie of the year. And while that is the case, the reason why Oddity is number 1 on this list is simply because this is the scariest film I've seen all year, without question. I feel like it's so rare for a horror movie to actually scare me. I'm either annoyed or bored by the constant jump scares, maybe I'm creeped out by the eerie psychological atmosphere, or I'm unsettled by the dark subject matter, but it's so rare for a horror movie to consistently terrify me from beginning to end. Not only did this movie scare me, it scared me multiple times. I cannot think of any other horror movie that has found the perfect balance of building dread and executing very effective jump scares. And this movie is not saturated with jump scares like Insidious, but there is a good amount, but they're so well done and so perfectly placed that most of them did make me jump. I feel like it's been so long since a movie has actually did that consistently from, like I said, beginning to end. And the craziest thing is, this movie is not some evil psychological nightmare masterpiece, like something truly horrifying and disgusting that'll just keep you up at night. Bare bones, it's really just a spooky ghost story, but it has masterful directing in terms of building tension and suspense. So in Oddity, we are following a medium named Darcy, and if you're unaware, a medium is someone who essentially has the ability to communicate with the dead or spirits. Well, her sister gets murdered, but that's not a spoiler, don't worry. The plot of this movie is Darcy is trying to get to the bottom of this murder using her psychic abilities. And this movie has just so many clever, scary scenes. The photograph scene, the tent scene, the opening scene. The movie is constantly conditioning you with the perfect mix of, hey, we're slowly building on this eerie atmosphere, but don't get it twisted. We will do a good jump scare and we will get you. And they get you. Perfectly balanced, and I've been saying for the longest time, jump scares are not inherently a bad thing. And I know that's gonna make the A24 geeks fucking roll their eyes, because when they hear jump scare, they think of Blumhouse. Granted, Blumhouse does have jump scare festivals for movies. They're very annoying. They have no sense of tension. It's just jump scare, jump scare, jump scare, predictable schlock. But that is why, because a lot of those movies have very poorly set up and therefore predictable jump scares with no sense of tension. In Oddity, the movie will spend 5 minutes building a perfect scene of tension just for one phenomenal, well-earned jump scare. It's like a perfect mix of Robert Eggers and Mike Flanagan. And it's also funny, like our characters are witty without breaking the immersion. They're interesting, we're invested in them. The story is also very intriguing. It plays out like a mystery at first, but quickly dives into more of a sort of cat and mouse, who can catch who first. And it spooks you, and it feels so good to watch a horror movie that doesn't have to be this extremely nihilistic, depressing nightmare to be scary. All it takes is just a good director and a good team. Best horror movie I've seen in years, easily, and I'm so glad it came out around the time Longlegs came out. Because this movie is phenomenal. But if it got the marketing and the hype that Longlegs did, guaranteed people would have unrealistic expectations and therefore call this movie ass or overrated or dog shit. It's got great cinematography, the acting, the writing is so good, with such a fun, strong cast of characters. I also really like the costumes and the set designs. It takes place in the modern era, but it feels very gothic, with the locations at an asylum or an old castle, the long trench coats that they wear, the lanterns that they use to illuminate the dark. It just has such a strong vision and mood. Whether you want to scream by yourself or with some friends, this is the perfect go-to horror movie. Now, before you say Swans TV, have you seen this movie? How come you didn't talk about this one? Here are all the horror adjacent movies I've seen this year. And yes, there were some bangers I didn't get to mention. There was also a few movies that I just didn't get a chance to see or that haven't come out yet. And that's why I didn't want to do an honorable mentions, because I'm probably going to do an updated list at the very end of the year or the beginning of next year, so I could do a top 20, because it does hurt me to do a top 10 horror movies of 2024 without mentioning I Saw the TV Glow, Late Night with the Devil, or It's What's Inside. But either way, that does it for my video. Thank you to everybody who watched. Again, I do apologize. This took a very long time. I really love doing YouTube. I'm going to be a lot more consistent with it. I've seen Anora, I've seen Gladiator 2, I'm going to see Conclave and Wicked soon, so expect a big roundup on those, hopefully within the next week. Alright, that does it. Thank you again, and I'll see you at the next one.